Pipeline Truth Uncovered. Danielle Smith shocks CBC's Rosemary on national stage. Danielle Smith launched a powerful challenge at CBC's Rosemary Barton, spotlighting what she called a federal chokehold on Canada's economic growth. Smith emphasized that the roots of this problem lie in Ottawa's heavy-handed regulatory regime and persistent ideological posturing. She argued that Alberta is effectively locked out of its own prosperity by regulations that are neither necessary nor efficient. Drawing attention to market opportunity, she explained that a pipeline to Prince Rupert could unlock more than $20 billion every year in revenue, while simultaneously reducing dependence on outdated U.S. infrastructure and tapping into dynamic Asian markets like Japan, Korea, and China. One of Smith's sharpest critiques was directed at BC Premier David Eby, accusing him of weaponizing ideology to block a pipeline that would deliver tangible economic benefits. She presented him as putting political identity ahead of jobs, affordability, and national unity. In contrast, she floated Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew as an example of leadership rooted in pragmatic optimism, an executive focused on generating employment, securing investment, and building interprovincial cooperation. Smith framed the central dilemma as stark. Canada must choose between unity through resource sharing or fracture driven by provincial disunity. Smith introduced her concept of a grand bargain as a pivotal alternative to the current impasse. Under her proposal, Alberta would accept certain federal regulatory standards, including updated elements of Bill C-69, but only in exchange for meaningful streamlining and fast-tracking of infrastructure investments. In this model, technical feasibility and economic potential would carry greater weight than ideological indicators. She called for eliminating vague, non-measurable requirements like intersectional impact analysis and expedited approval timelines for projects with demonstrated public interest. Alarmingly for many Canadians, Smith highlighted rising separatist sentiment in Alberta, with polls showing support nearing 37 to 50%. Rather than dismiss this trend as fringe, she presented it as a barometer of frustration, proof that Albertans feel their economic fortunes are being stifled by federal inertia. Quoting analysts, she remarked that absent substantive policy changes, national unity risks irreversible damage, with every postponed pipeline or stalled permit reinforcing regional divisions. Smith's critique extended beyond energy policy. She excoriated the federal government's focus on international aid and diplomatic symbolism, questioning why billions are being sent abroad for programs like gender equity in Honduras, while Canadians struggle with housing shortages, rising utility costs, and insufficient wildfire protection. She framed this as a moral and economic issue. How can the government prioritize overseas initiatives when local frontline services are crumbling? To illustrate her philosophy of long-term thinking, Smith shared the success story of Chief Billy Morin, a First Nations leader who turned a near-defunct community into a fiscal champion. Through rigorous financial discipline, budget laws, and administrative reforms, Morin's community reversed a substantial debt and now operates in surplus. Smith emphasized that this type of boring structural reform is the real engine of wealth, far more important than flashy soundbites or short-term subsidies. Further bolstering her argument, Smith described Canada's position at the G7 summit hosted in Alberta. Here she positioned the province as a global energy provider, with products like propane, LNG, and bitumen essential to allied markets. She raised the idea that Canada could emerge as a leading player in energy security if only bureaucrats in Ottawa would let the private sector build the necessary infrastructure. According to her, the summit was a rare opportunity to showcase Alberta's readiness to contribute to global stability, but federal roadblocks would render such potential moot. Yet Smith was careful not to portray herself as an absolutist foe of federal oversight. She acknowledged the need for balanced regulation, but argued that C-69, as currently drafted, includes ideological burdens that go well beyond acceptable environmental or economic standards. She proposed a recalibrated approach: retain oversight where warranted, but eliminate redundant or punitive layers that slow progress, inflate costs, and discourage investment in favor of faster, more transparent processes. Drawing on economic data, Smith painted a sobering picture of Canada slipping behind. She cited Japan's multi-trillion-dollar LNG agreements with the U.S. as emblematic of a global energy race we're losing. Whereas Trudeau's government dismissed the business case for Canadian energy exports, Smith countered that the lack of regulatory clarity and timely approval is itself the business case for failure. Without policy reforms, she warned, Canada stands to lose its competitive edge forever. Smith took aim at prominent federal figures like Mark Carney and Freeland, saying they represent a form of leadership divorced from ground realities. She described scenarios in which Carney's decisions, driven by elite interests, exacerbate inflation and energy insecurity for ordinary Canadians. Meanwhile, she described Ottawa's elite-level diplomacy as tone-deaf constructs that leave the middle class and working families paying the price through stagnating wages, rising costs, and a weakened job market. Throughout the interview, Smith maintained a tone of practical restraint, not partisan rhetoric. She clarified that her goal was not to dismantle all federal oversight, but to create a new blueprint for cooperation. The grand bargain, she proposes, would restore investor confidence, increase output, and streamline project timelines. It would also safeguard environmental protections by making them more predictable and grounded in science, rather than ideology. Underlying Smith's speech was a messaging shift within the conservative framework. She referenced a new conservative podcast focused on economic realism, accountability, and policy transparency, a strategic move to connect directly with voters through digital platforms and bypass traditional media filters. Smith argued that this change reflects a broader transformation. Politics should serve public interest, not elite messaging. In conclusion, what unfolded on CBC was not a conventional policy debate, it was a provocation. Danielle Smith made it clear that Canada faces a binary choice: continue down a path of ideological stagnation or embrace a future built on results-driven strategy. Her core message: Ottawa must choose prosperity over performance, collaboration over division, and discipline over dogma. She called on Canadians and political leaders alike to reject bureaucratic inertia and support a vision of national unity anchored in opportunity, diversification, and practical reform.